Welcome, everyone. I'm Tina Games, a very proud member of the Story Circle Network Board of Directors, and it is my great honor this evening to be your moderator for this wonderful webinar we're going to have this evening. It is Poetry Month, so this is a fantastic time to bring a very special guest, Sharon Charde, who is joining us tonight, and her webinar is Transforming Trauma into Art. And Sharon, I'm just delighted to be alongside you this evening because Story Circle Network, we've got wonderful group of women writers across the country and actually internationally. So we do have global members for Story Circle Network, and we do have a lot of poets in the group. So we're delighted to have you this evening. A little bit about Sharon before we begin. Sharon is a licensed professional counselor. She is a writing group leader and an award-winning poet, which is really just so exciting. She's also a Push Cart Award nominee 10 times. Sharon, that's amazing. And she's the author of 7 published collections of poetry. The latest one was published in September 2021, and the name of that is The Glass Already Broken, which was published by Blue Light Press. So it is my delight this evening to welcome Sharon to our webinar. And just for our guests this evening, for those of you that are participating, we are going to turn it over to Sharon here in just a minute, and we are going to take questions and your comments at the end. So just keep in mind, I will be monitoring the chat. So if you do have questions during the presentation, I'll do my best to answer anything that I can answer, but Sharon will be taking all questions at the end of her presentation. So with that being said, Sharon, it is my delight and great honor to turn this over to you this evening. So I'm going to come off screen and turn it over to you. So go ahead and welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Story Circle, for inviting me to do a presentation during Poetry Month. Which is such an important month for those of us who are poets, to see poetry, celebrated by the world and recognized. I had hoped to begin by having people introduce themselves, and I wanted to see all of you because I'm used to doing, workshops, or I call them retreats, actually. And find out a little bit about where you are with your poetry writing. But there's so many. I just found out before we started that would take up a lot of time, so we're not going to do that. But I would love to see you. I'm thrilled that you've signed up for this, and I will do my very best to give you something that you can be hopefully inspired by this evening and take home with you. And it's a huge subject, really. So this is just an appetizer. I have sadly become a specialist in this field since the death of my son 36 years ago. It's a club that no one wants to belong to, but those of us who are in it get that our fellow survivors are the only people who truly understand. I will do my best to share. I'm going to share some of my own experience with you, and as context for how I came to poetry. And please have some writing materials handy. The moderators tell me that you're used to doing that. So I decided that I would look up the word trauma in the dictionary. It's the word that is used. It's almost become, I don't know, hackneyed a little bit. It's used so much. So I thought I would, there are all kinds of levels of trauma. There's, but trauma is trauma. And whatever it is, whether, anyway, I will read to you what I found. And I think what I found sounds like being a human being to me. Trauma, shock, upheaval, distress, strain, stress, pain, anguish, suffering, upset, agony, misery, sorrow, grief, heartache, heartbreak, torture, ordeal, trial, tribulation, trouble, worry, anxiety, nightmare, hell, hellishness, or weariness. Who of us have not felt some, many, maybe all of those things? Trauma breaks apart our sense of self, our sense of meaning, our trust in the world, our connection, love. After trauma, we need to find agency, a way to gain agency in our lives, to shape the darkness, to hold it at a bearable distance. This is really important. This is what I want to get across to you tonight, if nothing else. I have I spent many years teaching in a facility for delinquent girls, and I tried to, who all were traumatized in so many different ways. And I tried to explain to them, of course, they didn't know the word inchoate, but it's like this, I said that it's this big mess inside of us. And it just like lurks inside of us and does all kinds of things and gets us confused and upset when we don't even know why. And so writing, particularly the writing of poetry, is a way to get that inchoate, that mess of feelings and emotions and experience from inside of us, outside of us. And when we write a poem, what we do is we create a work of art with that experience, which is another really wonderful thing. I mean, I would tell the girls, not only have you done this, but you're inspiring other people with your work, with your poems. I wasn't going to get to this till later, but I'm going to read you one of their poems. But I would bring them out to read. I wanted, many of them were Black and brown girls, and I live in a very white world up here in the northwest corner of Connecticut, and I wanted people to experience the lives and experiences of these girls. So I began to create places where they could go and read, and people would come and hear them. And they were stunned at the response. I guess I was going to say I was, but I really wasn't, because how could you not be? I've actually written a book, I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent, which is all about, filled with their poetry and my experience. You can find that on my website. But anyway, let me go to another book, Poetry as Survival by Gregory Orr, an amazing man. It's a very important book on this subject. And Gregory writes, when I was 12 years old, I was responsible for a hunting accident in which my younger brother died. To say that I was horrified and traumatized by the event is only to state the obvious. I lived for about 4 years after my brother's death without any hope at all. Nothing that I found in my culture sustained me. Even my relationship with the natural world, which had been so important to me earlier, was not enough to alter my grief. despair, and guilt. Then, thanks to Mrs. Irving, the librarian in my small public school, I discovered poetry. I had previously had a vague desire to write, but nothing had brought me to lyric poetry or the writing of it. In the small honors English class that Mrs. Irving taught during my senior year, she had us write all kinds of things: stories, sketches, plays, haiku. I wrote a poem one day and it changed my life. I had a sudden sense that the language in poetry was magical, unlike language in fiction, that it could create or transform reality rather than simply describe it. The first poem I wrote was a simple escapist fantasy, but it liberated the enormous energy of my despair and oppression as nothing before had ever done. I felt simultaneously revealed to myself and freed of myself. Revealed to myself and freed of myself by the images and actions of the poem. I knew from that moment on, all I wanted to do was write poems. I knew that if I was to survive in this life, it would be only through the help of poetry. Mind you, I'm not saying my early poems were good or that I knew anything about the skill of crafting a poem. Years of agonized apprenticeship were before me, but the experience of hope and pleasure was revelatory to me then and still underlies my understanding of an essential purpose and meaning of lyric poetry. So I was an English major in college, and I spent 2 years studying creative writing, which I adored. And we had to write a poem every week or a short story as well and put it in the box by 3 o'clock every Friday. But we read lots of poetry, but it was mostly T.S. Eliot was the big poet that we spent a lot of time on. And I was in love with poetry, but I was also in love with my husband, my then boyfriend, who became my husband, still is my husband almost 60 years later. So I got married right after college, as many of us my age did, and I had 2 children in pretty quick succession. So that was pretty much the end of my writing career. I had dreamed of going to graduate school or becoming a journalist, but I needed to make money as a teacher and take care of my children. So that's what I did. But then when I was 45, I was practicing as a psychotherapist, and my younger son was on his junior year abroad in Rome, and he died. He fell off the wall, diver, 50 feet, accident. We still have no answers 36 years later. And my life fell apart. My life as I knew it fell apart. It was just talking about it now, grief comes in waves. I mean, those of you who have experienced something like this know that it doesn't ever go away. You learn to carry it differently, which is something that poetry helped me do, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So I knew that my older son graduated from college a week after Jeff's funeral, and he was going to be leaving home, as of course is the right thing for him to do and what I wanted him to do. So I was no longer really needed as a mother. So I remember standing in my kitchen one day and I said, what's next for me? I mean, I had my therapy practice, but I said, I want to write. I have to write. And a friend sent us a brochure of a Madeline L'Engle workshop, poetry workshop or writing workshop. I can't remember. It was the Christmas after Jeff died. He died in May, and my husband loved Madeline L'Engle. And he said, well, let's go. Uncharacteristic of him, really. And so so we did. It wasn't that far from us. It was at Benedictine Monastery. And I wrote my first poem. It was called Prayer, I think. I haven't looked at it in a long time. And I remember being in a group of people, my husband's hands on my shoulder, my hands on Madeline's shoulder, and her husband had just died 6 months prior, reading this poem. All of us were crying in the room. It was an extraordinary experience. So I went out to study with her in Chicago for a couple of weeks, and I met somebody there who said, have you ever heard of Natalie Goldberg? You should come out to Taos and study with Natalie Goldberg. And you can come stay with me, and you need to do this. And so I did, and that changed my life. I was introduced to a kind of writing that was from the heart and the guts and not the head, which was what I had learned in college. And it wasn't poetry, but it was a release, an enormous release. I remember the first prompt was, I remember, and I remember the morgue was what came to me, and I read it in front of the group, and it was much like Gregory Orr described. What a relief. And to have my feelings put into words. So at some point I went to I was writing some poems, and they weren't very good poems. And somebody asked me to go to a writing group, a poetry group in a nearby town, and it was not a wise idea. I did go, and my work, my emotions, and my poetry was still too raw, and it was very painful to have somebody critique something I'd written that was too close to my heart. And I'm going to say here, be very careful, especially those of you who are beginning poets or people who want to write poetry, be very careful who you share your work with in the beginning. Very careful. It's important to find the right teachers. I'm going to give you the names of some people I think are magnificent teachers, and that will make all the difference. But in any case, I met someone at that reading who said, have you ever heard of Sharon? And I had not. And she said, your poetry reminds me of hers. What a compliment. But I didn't know that then. So we were meeting in a bookstore, so she pulled the book out and said, here's her poetry. I think it was The Gold Cell. And so I bought it, and I thought, somebody with a voice that feels like mine. I mean, I'm not comparing myself to her, but it felt, and this is what you need to do. You need to go to a library, go to a bookstore, in a good indie bookstore, go to the poetry section, and just go through books and find poetry that resonates with your voice, and read. I can't emphasize that enough. That is one of the most important ways for you to become a poet, become a better poet. Every time I sit down to write on that couch right behind me, and you'll see all the books in the shelf, they're all poetry books. I just pull out a bunch of books and I start reading, and I am immediately in another world, and I begin to write words down, and feelings just start coming. And before long, I have a draft, and I very much recommend this this way of beginning to write a poem. Um, so Sharon Olds was a teacher. I don't know if she still teaches. She's my age, actually. Um, I think she might still go out to Squaw Valley, but she was teaching at Omega Institute at Rhinebeck at the time, and I went to maybe 7 workshops with her, and then I followed her out to Squaw Valley, California, where there are wonderful poetry workshops. Highly recommend Squaw Valley Community of Writers. And she was so supportive to me. And that's another thing I recommend. If you're lucky enough to find a poetry mentor, that'll help you enormously in your, particularly somebody who has experienced trauma, who has experienced suffering, and Sharon certainly has. So I've also studied with Ellen Bass, Marie Howe, Brenda Shaughnessy, Eileen Miles, and I adore Ada Limon. I haven't studied with her. I haven't been that lucky. She's the poet laureate. Her poetry is fabulous. I recommend all of those poets to you. And many of them are doing workshops. And it's a wonderful way to immerse yourself in both writing, and they're all kind, wonderful human beings. And just look them up. That's Sharon Olds, Ellen Bass, Marie Howe, Ada Limon, Brenda Shaughnessy, and Eileen Miles. I'm going to read you actually a poem of Ellen's and one of Marie's. So I just started writing. I wrote and wrote and wrote, and I put together chapbooks. I looked for contests. I submitted work. It helped me so much to transform my trauma into poetry. And I was lucky enough to win some prizes for my chapbooks, which was very encouraging. And then I was writing all about Jeff's death, and I put a lot of poems together for my husband's birthday. Didn't know what to give him, and I put them together in a collection, and that later became Branch in His Hand. So that's a little bit of my journey, and hopefully yours could mirror that in some ways. I do want to say that poetry alone, writing alone, is not enough when you've experienced some profound trauma. You need to take care of yourself in other ways too, not just writing. Something that has been incredibly helpful to me is mindfulness practice. At one of Natalie's workshops, I met a woman, a psychic, Clara Rosa Marta, lives in California, as all psychics probably do. I don't live in Connecticut, I don't think. And she told me I needed to meditate, and I'm like, I want no part of meditation. But in any case, I ended up going to a meditation retreat on the side of a mountain in New Mexico, and it too changed my life. So the combination of poetry and mindfulness is extraordinary medicine. There's a wonderful retreat center in Barre, Massachusetts, called Insight Meditation Society. And there's also one, I think a lot of you are in California, there's a Spirit Rock. And I've been there once. It's a gorgeous place. And there's a lot of meditation teachers out in California. So it's a wonderful, I think I just said that, it's a wonderful complement to poetry, because it's all about focus, being in the present moment, learning to let go, not be attached. Has been a great help to me in both. I no longer practice as a therapist, I'm retired now, I'm full-time writing, but and living. But it was incredibly helpful to me in my practice as a therapist. You learn to be a witness, and that's one of the things a poet is. A poet is a witness. You're a witness. You're looking, you're watching, you're paying attention all the time. Carry a little notebook with you. And I often have ideas that come to me in the car, or, well, when I'm walking outside, I don't want to write anything down. I just want to experience the out of doors. But so I wanted to read this quote from Jericho Brown, and then I'm going to read you some poems. Since I've talked enough, and the poetry will speak for itself. Jericho Brown, a wonderful poet. The way I honor the sadness of my rape is my survival. The way I honor these things is that I look back and say, look, you're still here, Jericho Brown. I am here in spite of that, and therefore better than those moments of trauma. Poems have to be like the life we live, and have to be as complex as the life we live. So I'm going to read you four or five poems, which use different methods, or maybe that's not the best word, but different ways of transforming trauma into art. A coded way of writing, writing with detail without telling exactly what happened, a very direct and short, almost like a 4-line memoir, and then a poem that I wrote. I'll tell you about it before I read it. So tell you about why I think it's important for you to hear that poem. The first poem is by Ellen Bass, and it's called When You Return. And she never says what happened. She never says what the trauma is, but the hugeness of it tells us all we need to know. And she uses metaphor all the way through. Poems need a sense of mystery. We can read prose for direct information and facts. Poems need to have some mystery, not too much mystery, because then the reader gets lost and doesn't know what the poet is, isn't introduced into the feeling experience of the poet. Poet has to leave room for the reader, has to leave some big silences so the reader can feel like this is for me too. This is for me to experience. All the poets I mentioned are very, very good at doing that. And I hope I have become better able to do that myself. So here's When You Return. Fallen leaves will climb back into trees. Shards of the shattered vase will rise and reassemble on the table. Plastic raincoats will refold into their flat envelopes. The egg, bald yolk and its transparent halo, slide back into the thin calcium shell. Curses will pour back into mouths, letters unwrite themselves, words siphoned up into the pen. My gray hair will darken and become the feathers of a black swan. Bullets will snap back into their chambers, the powder tamped tight in brass casings. Borders will disappear from maps. Rust revert to oxygen and time. The fire return to the log to the tree, the white root curled up in the unsplit seed. Birdsong will fly into the lark's lungs. Answers will become questions again. When you return, sweaters will unravel and wool grow on the sheep. Rock will go home to mountain, gold to vein. wine crushed into the grape, oil pressed into the olive. Silk reeled into the spider's belly, night moths tucked close into cocoons, ink drained from the indigo tattoo. Diamonds will be returned to coal, coal to rotting ferns, rain to clouds, light to stars sucked back and back into one timeless point, the way it was before the world was born. That fresh, that whole, nothing broken, nothing torn apart. That poem, those images, and you just know the pain that she's feeling. It feels like it could have been it could be a lot of things, but it feels like the loss of a lover, or could it be the loss of a child? It could be the suicide of somebody you love. It could be a lot of things, but she never tells us what it is, but we feel it. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel that extraordinary pain that the poet is writing about by never telling us what it is? I do. Here's a poem by Marie Howe. And this is more specific detail. I like to write myself. I use a lot of detail. I use, that was a teaching from Natalie and Sharon as well. I think, well, all of these poets actually, but particularly those two. I like detail to hold the emotion rather than, well, it would be very boring in a poem to use abstractions that, say, oh, I feel terrible. I'm going to tell you how terrible I feel. I mean, that's not it doesn't reach a person very, very well, does it? So Marie also, she uses detail, but she doesn't, tell us exactly what happened, but we have a pretty good idea of what did happen to her. And we need to be changed by a poem. That's my belief anyway. I am not as interested in intellectual exercise kind of poems. I want to feel something. I want to feel a shift inside of myself. I want to feel comfort. I want to feel connection. I want to feel even a sense of some healing, or I've been there too. A lot of the poems in a magazine I love and I've subscribed to for my whole life, just about, but I don't like a lot of the poems, and they're very intellectual in the New Yorker. Sorry, New Yorker, but his poem is called The Attic by Marie Howe. Praise to my older brother, the 17-year-old boy who lives in the attic with me, an exiled prince grown hard in his confinement. Bitter, bent to his evening task, building the imaginary building on the drawing board they'd given him in school. His tools gleam under the desk lamp. He is hard as the pencil he holds, drawing the line straight along the ruler. Power Prince, young king, praise to the boy who has willed his blood to cool and his heart to slow. He's building a structure with so many doors it's finally quiet, so that when our father climbs heavily up the attic stairs, he doesn't at first hear him pass down the narrow hall. My brother is rebuilding the foundation. He lifts the clear plastic of one page to look more closely at the plumbing. He barely hears the springs of my bed when my father sits down. He's imagining where the boiler might go, because where it is now isn't working. Not until I've slammed the door behind the man stumbling down the stairs again does my brother look up from where he's working. I know it hurts him. to rise, to knock on my door and come in. And when he draws his skinny arm around my shaking shoulders, I don't know if he knows he's building a world where I can one day love a man. He sits there without saying anything. Praise him. I know he can hardly bear to touch me. A powerful poem. And I have, those of you who are experienced poets know about the turn, how important it is to have a turn. There's a turn, you know, where she's describing her brother in his room, you know, drawing his building, also a fabulous image. And all of a sudden her father's coming up the stairs. Well, there's the turn. And we're like, oh, what's happening? What's happening here? What's going to happen? So that's Marie. And here's a poem. I'm looking at the time. I really do want to share these last two poems with you. Because I want to give you some exercise to work on, you know, after this webinar is over. This is called The Portrait by Stanley Kunitz, a very, very famous poet who died in 2006. It's a different kind of poem, very direct, quite short. Somebody described it, I think Ellen described it as a 4-sentence memoir. The Portrait by Stanley Kunitz. My mother never forgave my father for killing himself, especially at such an awkward time and in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born. She locked his name in her deepest cabinet and would not let him out, though I could hear him thumping. When I came down from the attic with the pastel portrait in my hand of a long-lipped stranger with a brave mustache and deep brown level eyes, she ripped it into shreds without a single word and slapped me hard. In my 64th year, I can feel my cheek still burning. What a fabulous poem that is. Fabulous last line. So this is a good one to study. I hope you're writing down the names of these poems because you can look them up and get them online. It's a good one to study for line breaks, which is another important part of learning to write a poem, a good poem, where you break the line, you know, it's not prose where you have a sentence. And, you know, if my mother never forgave my father for killing himself, well, especially at such an awkward time in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born, well, that would be, you know, as a prose sentence, nothing like what it is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines with line breaks, and places where they're really important. So also economy of speech, that's another important thing to remember when you're writing a poem. Be very, very judicious with your words. Go over and over when you're creating, let it rip, write everything you want to write. Now, revision is another part of writing poetry. I'm not talking about that here really, but every word has to have weight in a poem. So you don't want a lot of extraneous words. You lose the reader that way. So I was going to read a poem from one of my girls, but I see that there's really not time. But I did want to share this poem with you because it's this is one of my poems. It's not very long, but I think it was the first summer, maybe it was the second summer, I can't remember, that I went out to Squaw Valley, the Squaw Valley Community of Writers summer workshop, which is in Squaw Valley, near Lake Tahoe. And it's a long trip from Connecticut out there. I had to change in Reno, and then I had to take a car from Truckee, and it was quite a journey, and an emotional journey as well. So on the plane, I brought with me, we had to have a poem ready the next day. And on the plane, I brought with me that summer after Jeff died, I kept a journal. It was a small, a beautiful Florentine journal book, little book that was in his things. And I imagined that he had bought it as a present for his mother. And so I used it that summer to write in, and I filled every page, and it was raw. It was just raw, raw, raw. And I hadn't looked at it for years. And I brought it with me and I read it on the plane. And out of that long journal of raw emotion, this is the poem I got. It's called Grief. It's from my collection, Branch in His Hand. An absolute purity within the borders and without cacophony. Everything slow, like the shimmer of heat off summer asphalt. Everything dry, like grains of dirt in a drought. A hummingbird whirring at the honeysuckle, hollyhocks higher than the barn roof. All equal here, a shared condition. Doesn't everyone die? Doesn't everyone seek rapture? And this is rapture, really. The untainted longing, the total clarity, the utter, immaculate emptiness. So that's an example of what I would call a distillation of emotion, which also is something you're looking for when you're writing a poem. Just reading those poems fills me. I hope you with a lot of powerful connection to your own experience, your own emotion, and as inspiration to write yourself. I'm going to give you a prompt. It'll be 10 minutes. Of course, being a person who's facilitated writing retreats and workshops for women for so many years, I would love to hear everybody's work, but I guess we won't have time for that. But I want you to have something immediate to take home with you, and I'll give you an idea of how, of what you might be able to do with it after you've written it. You have all this inspiration from the poems I've read. I hope you do. And now I'm going to give you a prompt, and this is a line from Stephen Levine. Stephen Levine has written extensively on death and dying. Not a poet, he's a prose writer. But he knows grief. Grief, we all carry grief. We all carry grief to a greater or lesser degree. Being human, being alive there are so many ways to mourn and to grieve in the world that we're living in today. Oh my God, I don't know about you, but it's really hard for me to open the newspaper every day and see what new travesty and tragedy has happened. I don't know what is happening in this world, but it's a very, we're traumatized every day. I believe we're traumatized every day, no matter our other experiences of trauma. We're traumatized every day by the world that we're living in right now. That's what I believe and feel myself. And again, not paying so much attention to I believe we have to find a balance between witnessing, paying attention to what's happening. Absolutely. There's painful, terrible things people are suffering, and it's important for us to witness that and to um, do whatever we can about it, contribute money, volunteer, but not let it take over our life. And that's one of the things writing, I think, has, again, it's been really helpful to me as a way to help process both the traumatic world we're living in and the personal traumatic experiences of my own life, not just the death of my son, but many other things as well. So Stephen Levine says, grief is the rope burns left behind. Have a glass of water. Grief is the rope burns left behind when what we have held to most dearly is pulled out of reach, beyond our grasp. I'll read it again. Grief is the rope burns left behind when what we have held to most dearly is pulled out of reach, beyond our grasp. Describe your grief in as much vivid detail as you can. So I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes. And I want you to pick up your pen. Please don't use computers. I believe very strongly in writing with the body, writing with a pen, fast-moving pen is the best. Pick up your notebook and try not to think too much. Just be with everything you've heard from me, you've felt in yourself, and take that prompt and write for 10 minutes. And don't judge try not to be judging yourself. But if you do feel judgment, write about that. Allow the monkey mind in, as they say. So, okay, go. 10 minutes. I'm going to write with you. Another minute. Okay, finish up. And don't worry about, in this kind of writing practice, don't worry about a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's, you're not, this isn't that kind of writing. Um, I would love, it's 8 o'clock, I can see that, I have a clock. And I want to leave time for questions and answers. I had hoped that we'd have a little time to share some of our writing. But instead, I'll give you time to ask questions, and I'll say a few things about the writing piece you just did and this kind of writing, which I highly recommend. I have notebooks full of it. That chest behind me is full of writing practice notebooks. Go through, and I do recommend Natalie Goldberg's book, also, Writing Down the Bones, and making a daily practice of writing practice. Journal writing is not, and to my mind, it is not as useful. A lot of people would argue with me, but I pretty much, I don't do journal writing very much anymore. I felt like I was writing the same thing all the time, and it's almost like a dwelling on something, the same thing over and over again. Whereas writing practice, you never know what's going to come up. Give yourself prompts. And one of the things I recommend to people to do with writing practice is, after, step away from it for a while, and maybe don't look at what you've written tonight for a few days. And then, I mean, it's only 10 minutes, I know, but take a highlighter and see what has heat in there. See, and maybe one phrase in the whole writing practice. Sometimes, and highlight it. And sometimes the very last sentence you write is the first sentence of something, of the first line of a poem. I've seen that so many times. I've heard so many women read their writing practice. I'm like, the last line is great, first line. And one of my teachers, I forget which one, often calls all that beginning writing the on-ramp. It's getting us ready and to make the turn into where we really want to be. And I find when I'm working on my poems, not as much as I used to, probably because I've been at it for such a long time, 35 years now. I get rid of a whole bunch of stuff in the beginning. There's a phrase that poets love to use, or they don't love it very much. I don't love to do it very much. It's called Kill Your Darlings. So if you feel really connected to someone and you're uh that may be, and you say, I can't get rid of that poem, that may be the line that needs to go. I just recently was working on a poem and that was exactly what I had to do. And it's good. It's a good thing to do. So moderators, help me out here. It's 5 after 8. Can we have Q&A now? What do you think?
Absolutely, we can. And
Okay.
I've just been monitoring the chat. First of all, Sharon, that was absolutely beautiful. May I just say, absolutely beautiful. And I just wanted to share one comment real quickly. This comes from Lucy, and she put in the chat, thank you for this workshop, Sharon, for sharing and for opening your heart and soul. I am touched. The world is breaking my heart as well. In your words, quote, it has been pulled out of reach, beyond my grasp, unquote. It helps to know I am not alone. So wanted to share that with you.
Thank you so
And
much. Oh, you're not alone. Not
yes,
alone.
and Marguerite says, this has been fabulous. And thank you so very much. And I am actually just putting in the chat. We are now taking your questions. If you have comments, please do put them in the chat. And I think we do have a little bit of time here, Sharon, if you're open to this. If anyone in our group here in our webinar this evening, if you've got something that you would like to share, maybe something short, I think we'd be open. Yeah, we'd be open to hearing it. So
That would be
if you, okay, perfect. Actually, Marguerite
maybe
does have a
maybe
question.
some people even got a poem. So sometimes you can just take a lot of your material and left justify it and work on line breaks and you got a poem. I mean, there's so many ways to skin the cat, so to speak, so many ways.
Yes. Yes. Well, we do have a question. So let me ask, this comes from Marguerite, and her question is, when do you know a poem is ready to submit?
Oh boy. That's a question a lot of people have. Um, I am, a lot of people say when a poem is finished, which I think would be a similar kind of question. And I've heard people say, oh, you never know a poem is finished. I don't agree with that. I do, I do think I know when a poem is finished. But what I would suggest, um, uh, first of all, be very careful about where you submit. Don't submit to a journal that likes, if you write, stuff like what I've been reading tonight and what I write myself, don't go to the Fence or some esoteric or the New Yorker or some highfalutin place or some place that takes material that's nothing like yours. So that it's important to kind of know the journals. And so that's really important. So you need, I mean, I now know there are certain journals I submit to that, I know like the kind of stuff that I write. And I get a million rejections too. Don't be afraid you'll get rejected a million times, but you'll also get some acceptances. So the answer to your question is, I guess what I do is I work on, I had a spate of time when my husband was gone. I usually have a writing residency and I write like crazy, but this is the first year in 16 years I haven't had one, which was really painful. But I made myself have one here. And when my husband left for a period of time, so I could be in my own head. And so I wrote, and then I put it away. And then I really recommend coming back to your work, a week later, a month later, and depending on, I don't know what this particular person has, what kind of life they have, how busy their life is, but and read it again, and you'll see if you're satisfied with it, or if you want to throw it out, or if it needs cutting. That distance, I highly recommend. You're never ready to submit a poem right after you write it. I mean, unless it's what I would call a found poem, which, and I have occasionally, well, that grief poem, I mean, that's exactly as I wrote it. I don't believe I did anything to it. And sometimes you have a poem like that. But it's rare. And so, I don't know if I've answered your question. You have to, you really need to relook at it at a couple of weeks or even longer. Work on it when you're writing it. And, spend some time with it, but you really need to come back with a refreshed mind, and when you can look at it with new eyes. That's what revision means. Revision, re-seeing. Oh, I don't know if that's been helpful to you. I think you need to have a certain feeling of confidence, also a certain feeling of confidence in yourself and in your work too. I would suggest, again, submitting. There's so much competition today. It's a very depressing, really. Don't feel bad if you get rejected, please. I mean, you will feel bad, but there's so much competition, and there's so many good poets. Really, so many people are writing good stuff, and some of the letters I get are, yeah, your work is great, we love your work, but it's not right for us, or we have too much other good work, or so just keep at it, and find the right journals to submit to. That's important. I can't give you advice because I don't know what kind of writing you do, but there are some journals that are very Story Circle Network. They have poetry contest. I was lucky enough to win a couple times, so that's a very kind place to submit.
Yes, and thank you for that. Well, Marguerite says thank you very much. Your response was very, very helpful, and I will share, because you mentioned it. We do have, and I just dropped the link in the chat. So Story Circle Network does have its 3rd annual poetry competition coming up. I've just dropped the link in the chat. Our topic this year is Lost and Found. So if any of you that are interested in submitting, please go to that link I just posted in the chat. The topic is Lost and Found. You just heard Sharon share her experience with the poetry competition. So thank you so very much for that, Sharon. And I actually have another question. This comes from Lynn. Do you revise with irony, metaphor, imagery consciously in mind?
No, very, very rarely. I am a completely intuitive writer. I mean, sometimes I remember being at a workshop with Marie Howe in Ireland. Oh, it was a wonderful workshop. And I wrote a long poem. I had been, we brought each of our grandsons to Rome when they were 14, so it was like a pilgrimage, so they could see where their uncle, who they never knew, had gone to school, and where he died, and meet some of the teachers at the school and so forth. And we had brought Max, our youngest. And so the poem was Max and the Pope. And it's still one of my favorite poems. It hasn't gotten published yet. Excuse me. But it was a pretty long poem, which is rare. I don't write usually long poems. And Marie said, when I read it to the group, she said, "Oh, look at that image you have of a couple had stood in front of us and they had offered croissants and orange juice to Max, and she said, look, you had the image of communion and the poem. I mean, I had no idea that that was the, that was there. I mean, it's just what I wrote. And so that I recently, though, I did write a poem where I used a lot of metaphor. I don't write a lot with metaphor. I write more with detail. But there's always metaphor in there, and that's really important. But it just felt right for the poem, and they just come to me. I mean, it literally, my process is I will sit down, as I said, on that couch and pull out some poetry book, and I just start writing words down, words that come out of poems. And then the words have associations. And maybe, I mean, I've been reading Eileen Miles' newest book, A Working Life, and she writes nothing like me, but I get very inspired. I love Eileen. She's a fantastic woman. And I got all these images just from reading. They weren't her images, but I'd get one word and it would start off a chain of, of thinking in my head. So I am a very intuitive writer. I don't labor over trying to think. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me to think too much. I think too much in life, and poetry is a retreat from thinking for me. And I go to a totally different place in myself when I write. When I revise, I can see, it's a little different. I could say, well, I need a little something here, or maybe that doesn't sound quite right, or let's get rid of that line. Or sometimes another interesting thing to do, Marie Howe suggested that take your poem and cut it into strips, make each line into strips, and just lay them out on the floor and move them around. You got to be loose with this. You can't hang on, kill your darlings. Sometimes the last line of the poem, like I said before, is really going to be the first line. You switch it all up, and I've done that too. It's really interesting. I don't believe that, like I said, the head might be good for some people, and definitely is, but for me, like I said, I'm an intuitive writer. I just write, and sometimes it works,
Well, Lynn has responded. She loves the idea of writing intuitively. So thank you for that. And Anastasia said she really likes the idea of moving lines around. That is wonderful. And I love that. I actually just wrote that down for myself, to move it around, because
yeah.
one of the things you had said, and I actually wrote it down, that the last sentence sometimes can be the first line of the poem. So I love that. I also wanted to share, Anastasia said she would very much like to read what came up for her during the writing. She says it's short. And so Anastasia, I am giving you, there you go. So go ahead, Anastasia, you should have an open mic. So go ahead and read.
Okay, I want to say, first of all, it's not a poem, but I do love the idea that something said about just finding a word or two that come from it. And as I was writing, well, you'll see where I was going. It's kind of a weird spot, but
no disclaimers, just read.
No disclaimers. Okay,
no
okay,
disclaimers.
Here we go. Something is wrong, I say to my husband. This pain is Mariana deep. Source unknown, shifting flank to gut to pelvis. There is no position in which comfort can be found, no words or caresses capable of ameliorating this, no breathing in and out. I lie on my side, longing for a release from this unrelenting ache, more profound than that of giving birth. I have heard this is true of stones, true too of grief. This, I lie on the floor, longing for death.
Mm.
That's it.
Wow.
What's the line about stones?
I have heard this is true of, I have heard this is true of stones.
Now,
True
that's the line that
of
jumps
grief.
out at me
Yeah.
right away. That's a great line right there. Stay with that line.
Yep. That's what I thought of too. I was like,
Yep.
wow, I hadn't even thought of it, but that's what it
Yep.
feels like.
Yep. Yep.
It
Yep.
feels like a stone. Yeah.
There's your metaphor. Stay with that. I want to say another thing about metaphors, actually, too. There's a phrase called the dead metaphor. And if
Okay.
you've heard it before, get rid of it.
Okay.
Like a twinkling star, a blistering hot, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lingering doubt. But the stone, that's a terrific line. Go with that and
Okay.
let it take you somewhere. You got it.
Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you. Anastasia, I'll add, I'm not a poet, but as you read, it sounded very poetic to me. I just love the beauty and the way that your words were flowing together. So sometimes we think we're not writing a poem and somebody else might hear a poem. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for organizing this. And thank you for being here. This has been wonderful. Thank you. I'm gonna mute myself again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for reading.
Yes,
Gutsy
definitely.
lady. Gutsy lady.
Yes, and we are open. If anybody else would like to read, we are certainly open. And I'm scanning the group this evening, and I know we have poets in this room. So if anybody would like to share something that came up during the 10-minute write, feel free to just let me know in the chat so I can unmute you. And, I had just a quick question that I wanted to touch on. When you were reading the poem from Ellen Bass, When You Return, one of the lines really jumped out at me, Sharon, and I kind of thought I wanted to explore this a little bit. Answers will become questions again. I'd like to explore that a little bit from the viewpoint of a poet. So answers will become questions again. I'd love to hear your insight on that.
Let me find the poem. I have all these papers here.
And that was Ellen Bass.
Yeah, I guess I don't really need to find the poem. Oh, here. Well, as you can see, all through, her theme all through the poem is things go back to what they were in the beginning, like plastic raincoats will refold. Now, one of the great things about this poem, she mixes up the mundane and the profound. That's another good thing to do in a poem. Don't have all mundane and don't have all profound. Mix them up. And like if you're writing a love poem, you don't want to make it sound, it's a very hard thing to do, by the way, to write a love poem. I mean, in a way, this is a love poem. I believe this is a love poem. This could be a love poem. I mean, it tells me the depth of her passion for whatever it is that she's lost. And so you don't want your love poem to be like a Hallmark card. I mean, well, maybe you do, and that's okay too. You can have it be whatever you want, but there's any good love affair leaves blood on the floor. You gotta have the blood and you gotta have the love. So and in the poem, we never want to have a poem that's just all one emotion. You got to mix them up. And I think I'm not really answering your question, but I'm talking about how she mixes the mundane and that line, the mundane and the profound. That line is pretty profound. Where how does she tuck it in here? I return to the line. And bird song will fly into the lark's lungs. Also great alliteration.
Mhm.
Lark's long bird song will fly into the lark's lungs. Answers become questions. And then after that, when you return, sweaters, she's got the S sounds, but answers will become questions. That to me is an example of a profound statement mixed in with, the white root curled up into the unsplit seed, the bird song will fly into the lark's lung. Not that those aren't profound, but it's an abstract statement mixed in with the metaphors. And that's another secret of writing. You don't want to ever go with all abstractions in a poem because it won't be any good. It will be boring, but if you use a lot of metaphors like this poem does, or detail, as some of the other ones do, you've earned your right to make a statement. Answers will become questions again, but you have to earn it. You don't want to write something like that and not have it mixed in with these other, she's got nature images, she's got bullets will snap back into their chambers, the powder. What answers will become questions again is really explicating a lot of what she's already said in image. But she's earned the right, and maybe she needs to let us know that that's what she's also trying to say.
Yeah.
It's elegant. This is an
Yeah.
elegant.
Yeah, it's interesting because when Anastasia was
Did that answer
reading,
your question?
actually it did, and it reminded when Anastasia was reading, and you said this line jumped out. That was a line when you were reading that line jumped at me, and you were talking earlier, about we need to be changed by a poem. So when we're reading the poem, I would imagine, I know it has happened for me, that there's a line that jumps out for whatever reason, and we can take that line and go explore it in a journal or for ourselves. And so so when you were reading that, I thought that is so interesting. Answers will become questions again. So that I'm going to take that into my journal this evening.
Very rich.
Yeah.
It's a very rich statement, isn't it? I mean, it's like, think of it as an image. It's like shoots all over, answers.
Yeah.
How about, the questions you have? What are the questions you have? Answers will become questions again. Or what are the answers you think you have? Maybe they're not really answers.
Exactly.
A lot to think about. That's what
Yes.
that's what you want in a poem. There's no it's like looking at a painting. I mean, there's no one way to see a painting. Every person brings their own experience to the painting. Every person brings their own experience to the poem, and a good poet leaves room for the reader, leaves room for the reader to get their own experience from it. I can't say that enough. That's really important.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for that. And Anastasia has added in the chat that she really loves the idea of looking for one thing from a free write and starting there for the next session, and then looking again for something that resonates and using that as a starting point for the next session, and on and on and on. So that really resonated with a lot of the women in our audience tonight. So I just wanted to point that out.
Right.
And we are getting to the bottom of the hour here. And I just wanted to share a couple of things, Sharon. This has just been so fantastic. I want to make sure that everybody has access to your website. So I've just dropped the link to your website in the chat. And I would encourage everyone, Sharon talked this evening about finding a teacher, finding a mentor. And I was looking at Sharon's website. And if you haven't taken a look at it already, you'll see that her last book, The Glass Is Already Broken, it's right there, and you can take a look at it, purchase it, go through and look. And so, Sharon, before I make a couple of announcements, I just wanted to give you an opportunity.
Here you go.
Oh,
Glass is
there you
already
go.
broken. There you go.
Yes, and it's a beautiful cover, by the way. Beautiful cover.
My dear friend, Jared, oh my gosh, I'm blocking on his last name. My God, how could I do this? I love this man. Anyway, my dear friend Jared, who's a fabulous sculptor and artist, Jared Beck. I've taken this from one of his pieces of art. It didn't come out the way I wanted it to, but anyway. That is a perfect example of the title of the book. I found, the glass is already broken. We look at something, it's beautiful, we love it, and we enjoy it for what it is. And, someday it's going to break. And that's sort of a theme of what I've been talking about tonight, actually.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful theme. And I can't thank you enough for being our guest this evening and our guest instructor. Again, it's Poetry Month. It was just a perfect match, and we're just delighted, Sharon. And thank you so very much for your time this evening. And I have a couple of announcements before we wrap tonight. But before I do that, Sharon, any closing words? Any closing words?
Any closing words from me?
Yes. Yes.
Right. Do it. Get your pen, get your poetry books, write. It's the best thing in the world. It's what I love to do more than anything. It's healing, it's joyful, it feels, doesn't always feel good, but it's a wonderful way to transform trauma into art, or transform joy into art as well. It's harder to do, actually. That's another whole topic. But yep, those are my last words. Do it.
Well, thank you. You are getting lots.
I'd love
lots
you to
of
read
good words. Yep.
I'd love you to read my poems, and I'd be honored. And go to my website. Is just my name. You just type my name in and it'll come up. So
yes. And we dropped the link for Sharon's website. Again, it's in the chat, and you can go there and find out about her book. And Marguerite said that she just received her copy of The Glass is Already Broken during the class. And she just went and ordered another book of yours because you're such an inspiration. So wanted to share that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much. It's a wonderful thing to put your voice out in the world, and you never know what's going to happen. And sometimes it's not so great, but it's a wonderful thing to be heard.
Yes.
And that's an extra plus of writing, and sometimes we're heard, and that's a beautiful thing. So thank you.
Absolutely. And you're getting lots of kudos here in the chat. I mean, Cindy, Lynn, people are saying this was such an inspiring presentation. So it's important for me to say that. Lots of thank yous. So when you have that opportunity. So again, thank you very much for being our guest instructor this evening. We are all very grateful, especially here in Poetry Month. And I just want to take just a minute here to make a couple of announcements. I just dropped in the chat our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, May 17th, which happens to be my birthday, by the way. Wednesday, May 17th is our next webinar. And the title is, If Our Stories Were Puzzle Pieces, What Picture Could We Build? And we'll be inviting Christine Hassing with us that evening. You can find out a bit more about her through the link I just dropped in the chat. And one other quick announcement that we have been sharing, we are going on a Sound of Music tour. Story Circle Network for the last 2-3 years has hosted this wonderful writing journey in Europe. It's been in Italy, I think, for the last couple of years, and we're going to Munich in April 2024. So I just dropped the link in the chat for anyone who is interested. It will be next spring, April 20th through the 28th. And you can find out all about it, and you can register in the link I just dropped, the Sound of Music Tour. So that is those are all my announcements this evening. Sharon, again, thank you. lovely, beautiful presentation. The recording will be captured and we'll be putting it on our special channel later on this month. And for those of you that have been here tonight, and even if you weren't here tonight, the recording will go out in a follow-up email. So I just wanted to let everybody know you can watch the recording again. So with that being,
send me a copy also?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And more